So I hope you will all be very respectful of that, and we are moving the show around. Help me welcome Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and what a pleasure to get to be here. Now, I've always, I confess, liked Norwich a lot, and always thought it was beautiful, and always enjoyed coming to the bookstore and stopping for a beer over at the inn, and on and on and on. But about 18 months ago, my daughter and my son-in-law bought their first house in Norwich. Barely. It's on Stoll Road, and if you go out the back door, you're in Thetford, not Norwich. But they pay taxes in Norwich, and in that time coming over to visit, I've really gotten a much deeper sense of what a tremendous community this is. Community means a lot to me. I think it's one of the places, it's the place where we went wrong in certain ways in this country, is in not making our communities as strong as they should be. And what a pleasure it is to get to have at least secondhand knowledge of a place that really is exemplifying what a community means. So what a pleasure to be here. Many thanks to the library and the Historical Society, and of course the bookstore. I don't need to tell you all that communities that didn't take their, the communities that took their bookstores for granted no longer have bookstores. So you don't need to buy my book, but do go buy some book before the year is out. Also, many thanks to you all for braving this day to come here. I confess, that I know lots and lots of good reasons why climate change is the worst thing that ever happened in the world, and there's lots and lots of horrible scenes I've witnessed and things. Some part of me feels it most viscerally when you get to about December 7th and it's about 52 degrees and it's pouring rain outside. I don't know if anybody else does this or not, but on days like this, I cannot help but mentally calculate exactly how much snow there would be if the temperature were where it should be, and it makes me extremely sad. I confess my vision of just a certain kind of hell is a Vermont winter that's just one long mud season that never ends. And I have a bad feeling that at least for a few weeks we're going to be experiencing some of that. So if I seem a little glum tonight, I'll try not to, but that's the reason. Let me do a couple of things tonight. Just bring you up to date for a minute on where we stand in this climate crisis, and then give you some sense of what there is to be done right now, because there's a lot to be done. The bad part I'll get over as quickly as I can. I'm always cognizant of the fact that one of my jobs in life is just to be a professional bummer-outer of people, and it's unpleasant for me and unpleasant for you, but we will get through it quickly. The last 18 months or so have been a remarkable reminder of just how badly we've managed to get this planet off kilter. You know, I wrote the first book about all this back in 1989 when I was 27 or 28, and we knew then what was going to happen. It's nothing complicated. You burn fossil fuel, you put carbon in the air, it traps heat, the planet begins to heat up. Even so, the way that it's heated up over the last year or two surprised, shocked, scared, maybe more than anybody, the scientists who've been working on this the longest, and certainly me. Go back to the summer before last, when we had a truly remarkable heat wave that settled in across the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. Before it was done, the all-time temperature record for Canada had been broken by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, this is a temperature record that goes back 100 years across thousands of stations. If you were ever going to set a new temperature record, it would be by 1/10 of a degree. That's how statistics work over a huge data set like that. But those old temperature records were on a different planet. So on this planet, the one that we've created, it turns out that you can run the temperature to 121 degrees Fahrenheit in British Columbia. As I say, breaking the old record by 10 degrees, the town where that happened, later that afternoon burned to the ground, the whole thing, in a forest fire that swept through that area. For scientists, it was a shocking reminder, shocking signal that systems were not degrading in a kind of linear fashion, that things were beginning to go exponentially wrong. And to the degree that we can track it, it has something to do with the rapid melt of the Arctic. When you melt the Arctic, and we've melted more than half the sea ice in the summer Arctic, what you're doing is reducing the differential in temperature between the equator and the poles. And that differential in temperature is what always has driven the jet stream. And so now the jet stream is behaving in ways that we haven't seen before. It gets locked in place. It has extreme amplitude. Depending on which side of it you get on, you have long stretches of drought or flood. That's scary. Scary, too, that as you melt the Arctic, you're pouring so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that you're beginning to dramatically slow down the speed at which the Gulf Stream works. It's dropped its velocity about 15% in the last few decades because those differences in salinity and density are what drive those huge currents. So we're messing around now with things at very fundamental levels. Things like the jet stream and the Gulf Stream are the biggest physical systems that operate on our planet, and they're no longer operating in the ways that we're used to. This year should have been a fairly gentle year climactically, because the Pacific is in a pretty strong La Nina cooling phase, which should be enough to drive down temperatures. That's what happens in normal times in the succession of El Nino and La Nina seasons. But we've changed the baseline so much that even in a strong La Nina year, we now see remarkable, say, heat waves. And this year, the action began fairly early, and it began on the Asian subcontinent, where for, about 8 weeks, they had temperatures like they'd never seen across India and Pakistan. The temperature day after day after day was way above normal. It was the hottest March and April ever recorded in those places, and by a lot. And of course, we're talking about places where people have to work outdoors and don't have access to air conditioning for the most part and things. It was brutal. That heat moved temporarily over Europe in the middle of the summer, and some of you saw the coverage of what happened when the UK had the hottest day ever recorded there. Of course, England has the longest temperature record on Earth because it's, the Victorians like to measure everything. And so there's more temperature records there than any place on the planet. Again, if you were going to break one of those records, it should have been by a tiny margin, 1/10 of a degree. That's how they've been broken in the past always. But this time, the temperature at Heathrow was 3 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it had ever been before. It was up above 104 degrees, which for the UK was astonishing. But we think that this heat wave in Europe killed about 20,000 people in the course of its thing, but Europe has it, in this case, relatively easy because they've got money, people have places to go, are able to shelter themselves, on and on and on. That heat moved across China this summer in a heat wave probably even more anomalous than the one we saw in Canada last year because of its incredible duration. Week after week after week, we had dramatically elevated temperatures across a place, not a remote part of British Columbia, but a place where hundreds and hundreds of millions of people live across China. There were stations in China now, temperature weather stations, where all 30 of the top 30 high temperature days ever recorded were measured last summer, okay? The most poignant scenes came from pictures of Chinese workers in their hazmat suits out theoretically giving COVID tests and things as part of their zero COVID thing, but people just passing out because the temperature inside the hazmat suits was just crippling, And then, when the autumn came, we saw the other really most marked phenomenon of climate change. If you wanted one fact to kind of understand this century, you could do a lot worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's why we get more rain in a place like this. I mean, if you want to find the people in this part of the world who are most easily understand the danger of climate change, talk with your local superintendent of public works. They've spent the last decade pulling out 12-inch culverts and putting in 18-inch culverts everywhere because the old book on rainfall just doesn't work anymore. But again, we can to some extent deal with that. They couldn't deal with it in Pakistan, where they had the biggest rainstorm probably on this planet since Noah. It rained and rained and rained for days and days and days and days across Balochistan and Sindh and other parts of heavily populated Pakistan. The rainfall, there were towns that got, so I can get this right, I was just writing it the other day in a piece for the New Yorker, and it was so crazy that I couldn't believe it. There were towns that got, in 1 month, 3 times more rain than they'd ever recorded in a year before. Okay? The total rainfall in the province of Sindh was 720% of normal. And the devastation was just incredible. People mostly live in mud houses in that part of the world, which work fine, except when there's 10 or 20 days of straight pelting rain, and then those houses just melt. They dissolve. They aren't there anymore at the end of it. 33 million people were displaced by that flooding. That's everybody from Boston to Baltimore out of their homes, okay? And the kicker, the thing to sort of bear in mind at all times when you're thinking about this is, and nobody in Pakistan did anything to cause this trouble. There's 200 million people there. They've generated well less than 1% of all the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, compared with the 300 million of us in this country who've generated about 25% of all the CO2 in the air. Not their fault. And it was, with that in mind that when people gathered, including me, at this climate conference in Egypt, that the big topic really was some kind of compensation for the loss and damage that the global South is suffering. And so the good news, in a sense, was that the UN agreed to set up a loss and damage fund. But I'm afraid it was probably a fairly Pyrrhic victory, because I'm not sure who, beyond the usual suspects like Denmark and whatever, are actually going to pay into that fund. I find it hard to believe that a US Congress that hasn't been willing to even consider reparations for African Americans because of slavery is going to be willing to pay much for reparations for Africans because of climate change. We shall see. But we're in a difficult moment that's going to get more difficult. We've raised the temperature 1 degree Celsius so far. That's what's caused the chaos I've been describing. We're on a path to raise the temperature about 3 degrees Celsius by the latter part of this century. If that happens, Katie bar the door, the level of violent chaos and flux that comes from that is probably more than is sustainable by civilizations like the ones we're used to having. The UN estimates that would produce somewhere between 1 and 3 billion climate refugees. Just trying to imagine that is almost literally impossible. So, our job is to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's not to stop global warming, it's too late for that. It's to stop it short of the place where it does damage on that kind of scale. And so I'm going to take a breath for a moment. We're through the really bad part. And now we'll talk about what we can do to make that happen. Because here, the news gets somewhat better than it's been in the past. We really are starting to understand the possibilities here. The engineers have given us a staggering gift in the form of the fact that over the last decade, the price of renewable energy, of energy from the sun and the wind and the batteries to store it, has dropped in price about 90%. Sometime 3 or 4 years ago, it crossed some imaginary line where it became cheaper than using fossil fuel to power the planet. The cheapest way to generate power on most of our Earth now is to point a sheet of glass at the sun, okay? And that is a remarkable, remarkable change, because it means that there's no longer a kind of technological or financial obstacle to making change rapidly at a scale that would begin to matter. Doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't, because, as we'll talk about, inertia and vested interest remain in the way. But it does mean that it's possible. Now, is it a free lunch? No, there are no free lunches here. This comes with costs. If we're going to do it, we have to do a bunch of things, including figure out how to mine a lot of lithium and cobalt and things like that in order to produce this technology. And that does not come without cost, human cost. We can figure out how to do it better than we're doing it now, and in ways that are not any more environmentally destructive than they have to be, but mining anything is trouble. So the question becomes more trouble or less trouble than we're in now. And here I just want you to get the sense of one kind of way that the world could be shifting. When we mine stuff now, fossil fuel, coal, gas, oil, to power our lives, what do we do with it? We mine it, and then we set it on fire, and then we have to go mine some more the next day. So if you mine lithium to build a battery or cobalt to help with your wind turbine or whatever, yes, you have to mine it, but then you put up the wind turbine and there it sits for the next quarter century, generating energy every time the wind blows, you know. If you mine some silicon and build solar panels, yes, it takes energy to do that, and you have to put steel in place and things, but when you're done, there it sits for 25 years, catching the sun's rays when they rise above the horizon. The guess is that the total mining burden of the planet, and this comes from Mark Jacobson at Stanford, would drop about 80% in a world that ran on renewable energy. One way to picture this, and this was a statistic that I spent some time this year unearthing, so it's stuck in my mind. 40% of all the ship traffic in the world, 40% of all the ships on the high seas are just carrying coal and oil and gas back and forth between places, okay? So in a renewable world, you'd have half as many ships out there plying the planet. You begin to get some sense of what we could do. In fact, the technology is at the point where it's entirely plausible that for the first time in 700,000 years, human beings could stop burning things on a large scale. Setting stuff on fire has been, well, Darwin said that along with language, it was the key human invention. You know, when we first learned to control fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, it let us cook food, which gave us a big brain. It let us move north and south away from the equator. And the anthropologists think that standing around the campfire all night was one of the things that helped our species develop the kind of social bonds that we have. And when we got to the Industrial Revolution and learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil, it's what produced modernity. It's what made us rich. So, you know, on balance, it's been, I guess, a good thing. But that balance has now shifted and shifted decisively. Shifted because of that climate threat, which is the biggest thing that humans have ever done by far. But even if it didn't exist, there are other reasons we would want to get off fossil fuel now that we can. And those reasons are at least two in number. One, when you burn stuff, you just inevitably produce a lot of pollution that is really bad for people. We finally have a good study on this from around the world last year, and the estimate is that 9 million humans a year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. Mostly those small particulates that are the inevitable consequence of burning fossil fuel and that get lodged in people's lungs. 9 million is a lot. It is 1 death in 5 on this earth. It's either the second or third leading cause of death on the planet. And of course, it's concentrated in the poorest and most vulnerable places, because we all know who gets to live near refineries and next to highways and on and on and on. The other reason we want to get off fossil fuel, if we can, was highlighted again this year when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and doing it on the back of the fact that the oil and gas that is basically Russia's only contribution to the world economy. 60% of their export earnings, 60% come from selling oil and gas. Go home tonight and look around your house to see if you can find something made in Russia that you might boycott to express your indignation. Unless there is an old bottle of Stolichnaya in the back of your liquor cabinet, I predict you will find nothing made in Russia, because all they are is a gas station to the rest of the planet, and they've used that threat to turn off the tap to cow Germany and France and the rest of Europe for many, many years. My old colleague, Lana Romanenko, who I've worked with for many years on climate stuff, when her native Ukraine was invaded this year, became the best champion of well, I've been on Zoom call after Zoom call with her this year, and often in the background you can hear the sirens going off or the bombs falling or whatever. And so she just keeps saying fossil fuel is destroying the climate and fossil fuel is bringing us fascism, and we can get off it. She's right. Anything, any resource on which one depends that's concentrated in just a few places around the world will mean that the people who live on top of those places end up with lots of unearned power and wealth. So in this case, Vladimir Putin, the king of Saudi Arabia, the Koch brothers, who are our biggest oil and gas barons and who used their winnings to degrade and deform our democracy, we don't need that. One of the best things about relying on the sun and the wind is that it would be very hard for Vladimir Putin to blot out the sun, or for the king of Saudi Arabia to turn off the wind. It comes to all of us everywhere. It's our common wealth, and we should be making good use of it. What I'm trying to say is, instead of setting things on fire, we should rely on the fact that the good Lord hung a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky, and we now know how to make full use of it. And this could be one of the really remarkable transformations in the course of human history if we did it quickly. Quickly. Because the thing to remember about climate change is it is a timed test. It's not like other political issues that we're used to dealing with. You know, as long as I've been alive, we've been fighting about whether we should have national health care in this country. And I think we should, and I think it's a sin that we don't, and I know that people die and go bankrupt every year as a result, and so we keep working hard, and God bless Bernie and everybody else who's in that fight all the time, okay? But when we finally get around to doing it, when we finally join every other industrialized nation in recognizing healthcare as a right, it won't be harder to do that because we didn't do it for the last 40 years. Climate change isn't like that. Once you've melted the Arctic, nobody has a good plan for how you go freeze it back up again, okay? When you pass these tipping points, they're a one-way ratchet. And so if we don't get a hold of this fast, and by fast, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us they told us a couple of years ago that if we wanted to meet the targets we set in Paris in 2015, 8 years ago, we would need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is 7 years and 3 weeks away, okay? So we've got a hell of a lot of work to do. Some of that work is organizing work, and I'll describe some of the stuff we're up to. And some of it now is the sort of execution and deployment of the things that we have at hand. Finally, this year, 34 years and 40 days after Jim Hansen from NASA first testified before Congress about the existence of climate change, finally, the US Congress passed a climate bill, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that came out providing $400 billion, maybe more, for this jump-starting this project of getting solar panels and wind turbines out, building batteries, putting electric heat pumps in people's basements, putting EVs in people's garages, putting magnetic induction cooktops in people's kitchens, all those kind of things. That's a fair chunk of money, but nowhere near what it'll take to accomplish it. The hope is that it will kind of prime the pump and get this moving fast, but none of that happens without people making it happen in lots and lots and lots of ways. Just to give one small example, the guess is that we need about 1 million more electricians in this country in the next few years to make this work happen. Some of you may have tried to find someone to put a heat pump in your house in recent months, and you know that it is not easy because there is a shortage of people who know how to do this right at the moment. That's why, you know, in a place like Vermont, we've got to make sure that VTC is busily churning out electricians. If you know a young person who wants a job that's going to be really helpful for the planet and is going to provide a good, steady living, you could do a lot worse than encourage them to go become an electrician or something like it, because that's where a lot of the work now needs to get done. But we also have lots and lots of work left to do to try and make this happen more smoothly. The fossil fuel industry is now understands that eventually we will move away from coal and gas and oil for all the reasons I've been describing. But they are determined that that move come very, very slowly. And they are using everything in their power to slow down, delay, put obstacles up at all times, and with a great deal of success in place after place after place. Look, Massachusetts is finally about to inaugurate its first offshore wind farm, but it took 12 years of brutal legal battle with the people backed by the fossil fuel industry to allow that to happen. We can't let that kind of thing go on. So we're pushing hard, say, on the big US banks. The 4 big US banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, are also the 4 biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. They've given them more than $1 trillion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage the thing. They were willing to do it themselves. So we're hard at work I'll talk about Third Act in a minute, but our big project for the spring is spearheading a day of action that now has support from the Sierra Club and lots of other places for a day of action against those banks. You're going to remember the date because it's March 21st, which is 3-2-1-2-3. Irresistible date for organizers. But we're going to be, cutting up credit cards, and we're going to be sitting down in bank lobbies, and we're going to be doing all those kind of things around the country until people realize that their local branch of those banks might as well have a smokestack on top of it, because it is pouring carbon out. If you have $125,000 in the mainstream banking system in this country, it's producing more carbon than all the flying, cooking, heating, driving, cooling that the average American does in an average year, because it's getting lent out to build new pipelines and gas terminals and things like that. So this is a really important place to be continuing to work and work hard. Let me end by, so I save some time for questions, by saying, addressing the question of who I think should be doing this work most of all right now. I've been, my volunteer life, which has been most of my life now for the last 25 years, has been, building movements around climate change, and doing it mostly with young people. When we started 350.org over in the western edge of Vermont in 2008, it was me and 7 college students, and they were fantastic. And we've organized 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea in the years since. Helped spearhead the fight against the Keystone Pipeline. Launched this massive fossil fuel divestment movement that's now at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested. Most of that work in the divestment fight was done by young people, because a lot of it was done on college campuses. Now Harvard and Princeton and Middlebury and UVM and Oxford and Cambridge and the University of California and the University of Michigan and things have all divested. And young people have done staggeringly great work in making that happen. When they got out of school, they wanted to keep going, so they formed this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal, and it was the Green New Deal in shrunken form that finally emerged as this climate bill this summer. It turns out that if you want $500 billion to eventually make it through Congress, you better ask for $30 trillion at the start, because that's about what happened over time, okay? They're remarkable. And of course, younger people than that are truly, truly at the head of this fight. You all know who Greta Thunberg is, and you should. She's great. She's one of my favorite people to work with on the whole planet. I just adore her. She would be the first to tell you that there are 10,000 Gretas scattered around the earth, and there really are, and that they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on school strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. So they're doing their job. The kids are all right. I listened, though, to one too many people tell me that it was up to the next generation to solve this problem, which seemed to me some combination of ignoble and impractical, because for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, young people lack the structural power to force the change that we need in the time that we have. So I've become quite possessed with the idea over the last little while that we also need to organize old people like me. That's why we started Third Act a year ago. The reason I'm leaving sharp at 7:30 and push me out the door is because at 8 o'clock we have our first birthday national Zoom call tonight for Third Act. It's been remarkably fun, but remarkably important, because there are a lot of us. There might even be a couple of people in that category in this room tonight. There are there are 70 million people over 60 in this country. That's bigger than the population of France. Not only are there a lot of us, we punch above our weight politically because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? And fair or not, we ended up with most of the resources. You know, not all old people are affluent or even comfortable, but 70% of the country's financial resources belong to the baby boomers or the silent generation above them, okay? So if you wanted to move Washington or Wall Street, which I would like to do, it helps to have some people with hairlines like mine in this fight. People haven't tried to organize this cohort for progressive politics in a long time, probably not since Maggie Kuhn and the Grey Panthers back in the 1970s. And the reason is because political scientists keep insisting that people get more conservative as they age. There's some statistical evidence for that, but we can't let it be true. And in this case, we don't need to let it be true because this particular cohort of older people is very interesting and unique. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, your first act was back in the period of extraordinary social and cultural and political transformation in this country. The time when we started taking women seriously as political actors. The time when we reached the apex of the civil rights movement. The birth of modern environmentalism with the first Earth Day in 1970. If you don't believe me, look at the things that the retrograde Supreme Court decided to take on in this summer of vandalism that they just engaged in. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, Roe v. Wade 1973. That's bad, but it's also good. We won these fights once, we can win them again if we organize and push. And indeed, people now are organizing and pushing in all kinds of good and exciting ways. Just in a year, we've had tens of thousands of people sign up, and they've organized themselves in really remarkable ways already. There are working groups all over the country. I was on the Zoom call yesterday morning with Third Act Vermont with the divestment subcommittee of the climate committee of Third Act Vermont. There were 9 people on the Zoom call working on divestment in the state of Vermont because Vermont's pension fund has still not divested from fossil fuel, which is an enormous sin. But they were hard at work and they'll get it done, especially if you give them some help. If you'd be willing to go home tonight and do one thing, it would be to just pen a note to our new state treasurer, Mike Pisciak, saying, get this done. Now, it's an easy thing to do. It won't cost a thing. It will actually save the state money. And let's get it out of the way and cross it off the list so we can go on to more difficult and important things going forward. At any rate, it was just exciting to see them there and doing that work and to see it all over the country. Older people don't need to lead this fight, but they do need to be a big part of it. We need to be, in some ways, in service to the younger people who are leading this fight, and it's really fun to do that. I was at a demonstration in Brooklyn a couple of weeks ago outside these big banks. We were marching from one to the next, Chase to Citi to Bank of America. And you know, there were a couple of hundred high school kids there because they completely understand that it's their lives that are on the line here. So, and also they're somewhat sprier, so they were out in the lead of this march. But at the back, there was a big bunch of us third actors with a sign, big banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." You know, so it helps to do things with a certain sense of humor, I find, from time to time. It's fun to look out and see your neighbor Gus Speth here because it reminds me of the moment that really this started dawning on me it might be possible. That was at the beginning 10 years ago of this fight against the Keystone Pipeline. And I wrote the letter that asked people to come to Washington to come get arrested in what turned into the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country in a very long time. 1,200 and some people, Gus included, went to jail. I know because we were in adjoining cells and chatting through the bars for several days. When I wrote that letter, I said, I thought this was one case where young people shouldn't have to be the cannon fodder. They'd been doing most of the leading, but if you're 19, you know, it's possible that an arrest record is not really the best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? You know? And you know, we did not ask people as they were getting arrested, how old are you? Because that would be rude. But we did, cleverly, I think, say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was old enough, he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which, I mean, I'd truthfully forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was really good for the young people who were there to see their elders acting the way that we need elders acting in a working society. I don't mean necessarily getting arrested, but I do mean being outside your comfort zone. Because the planet is outside its comfort zone, and our democracy is outside its comfort zone. And if we do not act outside our comfort zones, we will not get those things back in some kind of working order. None of us wants our legacy to be, and you know, legacy sounds abstract, but legacy means the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. None of us wants our legacy to be that we left the world a worse place than we found it, but that's what we're on the verge of doing. So that's why so many people are joining in this work and joining in with a light heart, not a heavy one. Because we don't know if we're going to win. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. But we do know that if we push, our odds get better. So I hope that some of you here will join in that work going forward. And I thank enormously, because I know many of you have already been engaged in all this work. I thank you so much for doing that. I wish I could guarantee you we could win. All I can guarantee you is that you have an enormous number of brothers and sisters all around the planet who are in this fight and in it in the best possible way. So thank you all very much. And I've left just enough time for a few questions or comments or critique or abuse or whatever. I've let you have it full square, so feel free to reciprocate. If you shout it out, I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear it through the microphone.
How much does the military and war contribute to climate change?
How much does the military and war contribute to climate change? Well, it's a really interesting question, and it helps get the sense of the scale of all of this. The US military is the single biggest institution in the world producing carbon dioxide, which is remarkable if you think about it. On the other hand, the US military produces less than 1% of the world's carbon dioxide, which is a reminder that carbon comes from everything we do all the time. So just to understand how that could be, picture, you know, just imagine the scene that you know, every time that you've been down on Route 128 at 5:30 in the afternoon and there's a line of cars forever and red taillights going on and stuff, multiply that by every city on earth every afternoon forever and ever. Think about all those furnaces in all those. There's 140 million houses and apartment units in this country. You begin to sense how there's no one sort of point source for pollution. The military, I think the military's biggest role in all of this has been the fact that we've used it to protect our access to oil for so long. That's what so many of our wars have been about, you know. And it would be very nice to imagine taking some of that organizational ability and whatever else that comes with the Pentagon and using it instead for defense against the thing that truly is threatening us now. And we're getting a tiny bit of that. The day after the invasion of the Ukraine, I have a little newsletter on Substack called The Crucial Years, and I used it to launch this campaign the next day called Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom, because it would be a huge help to Europe this winter and next to have a lot of energy efficient heating technology, because they're getting squeezed. The price of natural gas is really high. And within 90 days, mostly working through Third Act, we'd managed to get enough people pushing this that the Biden administration actually authorized under the Defense Production Act and came up with $250 million to start this production of heat pumps for peace and freedom. So that's the, you know, to me, that's the kind of work that we need to be doing right now, and doing fast. You know, we won the last fight against fascism with tanks and airplanes and things. We'll need, obviously the Ukrainians need some of those, but we'll probably win this fight at least as much with solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and all the things that free people from dependence on autocrats for energy.
Where will those heat pumps go?
Well, that's a good question. The question at the moment is whether, the question was, where will those heat pumps go? The hope is that they were going to go to Europe, but under this Defense Production Act authorization, it may be that a lot of them end up in the United States, which in some ways is okay. It's all kind of fungible in carbon terms anyway, and that will free up more from other places to end up in Europe. But we really should be having a kind of lend-lease, you know, World War II era program to get not just heat pumps. You know what the other thing we have in abundance here? We have factories that produce more of than we use that they desperately need across a lot of Europe is insulation. Some of you have spent time in the UK, for instance, and you know that it's like just marked by one drafty cold house after another. It's not a good place this time of year, you know. And we should be filling ships with that rolls of that pink insulation and getting it over there. And we're working on pushing that, and I hope people will join in.
Bill, if I may, I would suggest some heat pumps in that town municipal building that's a 2-minute walk from here, where we're about to buy a fossil fuel boiler, you know, take some local action.
Heat pumps are really good technology. You know, this is an interesting question because, as you know, Vermont failed the last 2 years to pass this Global Warming Solutions Act and things, and it was kind of sad that we did. But in a certain sense, it may have been a kind of blessing in disguise, because a lot of the money that was, or a lot of the work that was going to go there was towards things like liquid biofuels and stuff that seem less useful now. The dramatic reduction in the price of renewable energy is maybe a gift now for those of us who've waited a long time to get started, because right now it's really much easier to make these investments than it was in the past. But it doesn't mean that even a place like Vermont will get this done without a lot of work. And part of that work is the mental work of deciding that we need to look at the world in slightly different ways. The Public Service Commission in Vermont has turned down 3 solar farms this year solely on aesthetic grounds because people don't want to look at them. That's not okay anymore. We are in a true emergency, And part of that means that we've got to change our aesthetic enough that if we look up at a wind turbine up on the ridge, we see it as something kind of beautiful. The breeze made visible, and people taking some responsibility for the provision of the commodities that we use to run our lives. I'm over in the Champlain Valley where we grow a lot of corn. Corn is a solar collector too, and not a particularly efficient one. You've got to pour a huge amount of nitrogen on it to make it grow, and that nitrogen washes into Lake Champlain and produces those algal blooms. And what do you get with the corn anyway? You feed it to cows so you can produce more milk, which we have more of than we know what to do with. That's why dairy farms keep going bankrupt. If some of that farm acreage becomes devoted to solar panels, that's a good thing, because electrons are a crop we use a lot of. And in fact, it allows that land to rest for a while. You don't have to pour nitrogen on it to produce solar energy. In fact, we're now learning that you can graze animals in between the solar panels, and that there are certain crops that like the shade that they provide, and on and on and on. We've got to develop a slightly different aesthetic to reflect the crisis that we're in.
What do you suggest we can actually practically do to help prepare that March 21st?
Yes, this March 21st thing, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3. You all remember that? I remember it. So here's what we need you to do. We need you to go to Third Act and sign up. And then start figuring out some good actions to do. A lot of them are going to focus around it's kind of hard for people to move their bank accounts if they have them, or their mortgages or things. But if you look in your wallet, there's a pretty good chance that most of you have a credit card that's somehow tied to Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, or B of A. Your United Airlines card, your Costco credit card, your Amazon credit card, things like that. You can find a different credit card, and then on that day, we're going to be cutting them up. And we're going to do it you need to figure out some clever ways to do it so that, the Valley News will have a picture of it on the front page. We're going to have people underwater on dying coral reefs in the Florida Keys cutting up credit cards, and people against those. I just talked to Rebecca Solnit, my old friend and the greatest essayist at work in America today, and she's like, well, I'm going up to Sonoma on the, scar of that last huge forest fire, and I'm going to get people there, and we're going to cut up our credit cards. So figure out some good way to do it here that will draw some attention. I don't know if there's branches over in the Upper Valley of Chase and Citi, but there might well be, especially across the river in Lebanon or someplace. Well, the alternative, if you, there's lots you can find credit cards, and
I've got a credit card right here in my hand. It's the North Country Credit Union.
There you go. Credit unions are a very good way to do this.
The money goes directly back into your local community.
Thank you.
You're not having to send it off.
That's right. There's credit unions. Local banks are good. If you want a big national bank, there's now 3 or 4, including First Republic, that are divorced from the fossil fuel industry, on and on and on. But even if you're not ready to cut up your credit card, you can join in this day of action, because the goal of it is not to make ourselves feel good in the end. The goal of it is to put enough pressure on these guys that they change what they're doing. I was just talking to our artist in residence at Third Act today, and he's, among other things, coming up with plans that everybody can use for how to build out of cardboard 20-foot tall smokestacks that you can attach to the side of your local branch bank, because we need people to understand that though they look benign, they in essence are just producing vast clouds of carbon out into the atmosphere. I think we've got time for, yes, one more if someone wants to ask it. You've got it.
I just what you said, I was wondering what, just average citizens can do to reduce pollution, carbon.
What can average citizens do? Well, some of the things are, some of the things are things you can do around your house, and you know what those are, and we've been talking about them. But it remains the fact that the most important and impactful things you can do are things that we do together. You know, the biggest thing an individual can do about climate change is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to really spark change. That's why we set up 350.org. It's why kids set up the Sunrise Movement. It's why we've set up Third Act now. So find some people to work with. 350 Vermont's fantastic. Third Act Vermont's doing amazing things. I think it's actually really important for people of our age to be working to some degree through that Third Act stuff, because one of the things we have to do is redefine our society's sense of what older people are supposed to do. I'll just tell you, I'll end by saying that if there was one thing that motivated me more than any other, it's my least favorite bumper sticker in the world that you sometimes see on the back of Winnebagos and things, and it says, "I'm spending my kid's inheritance." You know, yes, you are, and that's vile. It's not okay. What we need to do is demonstrate that even once we're closer to the exit than we were to the entrance, we care a great deal about this world, and we have, theoretically anyways, acquired over the lifetime the skills to do something about that concern. So join something. Push hard, and thank you enormously for building the kind of communities that give us some hope that we can make this done. Now just spread that out as wide as you can, make as much of a difference in the larger world too as it's possible for you to make. I apologize enormously for running off, but that's what I'm gonna do. I'm so grateful to y'all, and I will see you all before long, I hope, at this side of the jail or the other. So on we go. Many thanks. Thank you so much.